Chapter 4. Once, said the preacher, we were sitting on the couch and Winn-Dixie was sitting between us. Winn-Dixie already had decided that he liked the couch a lot. Once, said the preacher. Winn-Dixie looked at him hard. Your mama was funny. She could just make about anybody laugh. 2, he said. She had red hair and freckles, just like me, I said. Just like you, said the preacher. 3, she liked to plant things. She had a talent for it. She could stick a tire in the ground and she could grow a car. Winn-Dixie started chewing on his paw and I tapped him on the head to make him stop. 4, said the preacher. She could run fast. If you were racing her, you could never let her get a head start because she would beat you for sure. I'm that way too, I said. Back home in Whately, I raced Liam Fullerton and I beat him, and he said it wasn't fair because boys and girls shouldn't race each other then to begin with, and I told him he was just a sore loser. The preacher nodded, and he was quiet for a minute. I'm ready for number 5, I told him. 5, he said. She couldn't cook. She burned everything, including water. She had a hard time opening a can of beans. She could make head nor tails of meat. 6, said the preacher, rubbing his nose and looking at the ceiling. Winn-Dixie looked up too. Number 6 was that your mama loved a story. She would sit and she would listen to stories all day long. She loved to be told a story, especially like funny stories, ones that made her laugh. The preacher nodded his head like he was agreeing with himself. What's number 7? I asked. Let's see, he said. Well, she knew all the constellations, every planet in the nighttime sky, every last one of them. She could name every one of them and point them out, and she never got tired of looking at them stars. Number 8, said the preacher, with his eyes closed. She hated being a preacher's wife. She said she just couldn't stand having the ladies at church judge her and what she was wearing and what she was cooking and what she was singing. She said it made her feel like a bug under a microscope. Winn-Dixie lay down on the couch and he put his nose in the preacher's lap and the tail in mine. 10, said the preacher. 9, I told him. Okay, 9, said the preacher. She drank beer, she drank whiskey, she drank wine. Sometimes she couldn't stop drinking, and that made me and your mama fight quite a bit. Number 10, he said with a long sigh. Number 10 is your mama loved you. She loved you very much. But she left me, I told him. She left us, said the preacher softly. I could see him pulling back into that old turtle shell. She packed her bags and she left us, and she didn't leave one thing behind. Okay, I said, and I got up off the couch and Winn-Dixie got up too. Thank you for telling me, I said. I went back to my room and wrote down all the 10 things the preacher had told me. I wrote them down just the way he said them to me so that I would never forget them, and then I read them and read them out loud to Winn-Dixie until I had them all memorized. I wanted to know 10 things inside and out. That way, if my mama ever came back, I could recognize her, and I would be able to grab her and hold on to her tight and not let her get away from me ever again. Chapter 5. Winn-Dixie couldn't stand to be left alone. We found that out real quick. If me and the preacher went off and left him by himself in the trailer, he pulled all the cushions off the couch and off the toilet paper off the toilet roll. We started trying to tie him outside on the rope when we left, and that didn't work either. Winn-Dixie howled and howled until Samuel and Mrs. Detwiller's dog started howling too. It was exactly the kind of noise that people in an adult trailer park do not like to hear. He just didn't want to be left alone, I told the preacher. That's all. Let's take him with us. I could understand the way Winn-Dixie felt, getting all left behind. He probably made his heart feel empty. After a while, the preacher gave in, and everywhere we went, we took Winn-Dixie, even to church. The Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi isn't a regular-looking church. The building used to be a Pick-It Quick store, and when you walk in front, the first thing you see is Pick-It Quick motto. It's written on the floor in little tiny tiles that say, pick, 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 quick, quick, quick. The preacher tried to paint over it, but it was no use. The letter don't stay covered up, so the preacher just gave up and let him get be. The other thing about Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi is that they was different from other churches is there were no pews. People had to bring their folding chairs and lawn chairs, and so sometimes it looked more like a congregation watching a parade or sitting in a barbecue instead of being at a church. It's kind of strange church, I thought. Winn-Dixie would fit right in. But the first time we brought Winn-Dixie to Open Arms, the preacher tied him up outside the door. Why did we bring him all the way here just to tie him up? I asked the preacher. Because dogs don't belong in church, Opal, the preacher said. That's why. Well, he tied Winn-Dixie up to that tree and said how there were lots of shade for him and it ought to work out real good. Well, it didn't. The service started and there was some singing, some sharing, and some praying. And then the preacher started preaching. And he wasn't but 2 or 3 words into his sermon when there was a terrible howl coming from outside. The preacher tried to ignore it. Today, he said. "Ow!" said Winn-Dixie. "Please," said the preacher. "Ow, ow, ow!" said Winn-Dixie back. "Friends," said the preacher. "Ow, ow, ow!" wailed Winn-Dixie. Everyone turned in their lawn chairs and fold-up chairs and looked at one another. "Opal," said the preacher. "Ow!" said Winn-Dixie. "Yes, sir." "Go get that dog," he yelled. "Yes, sir," I yelled back. So I went out and untied Winn-Dixie and brought him inside, and he sat right beside me and smiled up at the preacher, and the preacher couldn't help it, but he smiled right back. Winn-Dixie had that effect on him. And so the preacher started preaching again. Winn-Dixie sat there listening to it, wiggling his ears this way and that, trying to catch all the words, and everything would have been all right, except a mouse ran across the floor. The Open Arms had mice. They were there from when it was a Pick It Quick, and there were lots of good things for them to eat in the building when it was a Pick It Quick, and it became the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. The mice stayed around to eat what was left over from all the potluck suppers. The preacher kept saying he was going to have to do something about them, but he never did. Because the truth is, he couldn't stand the thought of hurting anything, even a mouse. Well, Winn-Dixie saw that mouse, and he was up and after him. One minute, everything was quiet and serious, and the preacher was going on and on and on, and the next minute, Winn-Dixie looked up like a furry bullet shooting across the building, chasing that mouse. He was barking, his feet were skidding all over the polished Pick It Quick floor, and people were clapping and hollering and pointing. They really went wild when Winn-Dixie actually caught the mouse. "I've never in my life seen a dog catch a mouse," said Mrs. Nordley. She was sitting next to me. "He's a special dog," I told her. "I imagine so," she said back. Winn-Dixie stood there up in front of the whole church, wagging his tail and holding up the mouse real careful in his mouth, holding onto it but tight but not squishing him. "I believe that mutt's got some retriever in him," said somebody behind me. "That's a hunting dog." Winn-Dixie took the mouse over to the preacher and dropped it right at its feet. And then the mouse tried to get away, and Winn-Dixie put his paw right on the mouse's tail. He then smiled up at the preacher and showed him all his teeth. The preacher looked down at the mouse. He looked at Winn-Dixie, and he looked at me. And he rubbed his nose, and it got real quiet in the Pick It Quick. "Let us pray," said the preacher finally, "for this mouse." And everybody started laughing and clapping, and the preacher picked up the mouse by the tail, walked it out, and threw it out the front door of the Pick It Quick, and everybody applauded again. Then he came back, and we all prayed together. I prayed for my mama. I told God how much she would love hearing that story of Winn-Dixie catching that mouse. It would have made her laugh, and I asked God that maybe I could be the one to tell her that some one day. And then I talked to God about how I was lonely in Naomi because I don't know that many kids. Only ones from church that weren't kids at Open Arms were just Dunlop and Stevie Dewberry. They were 2 brothers who weren't twins, but they looked like they were. And then there's Amanda Wilkinson, whose face is all pinched up like she's smelling something really bad. And then Sweetie Pie Thomas, who was only 5 years old and still mostly a baby. And none of them wanted to be my friend. Anyways, because they probably thought I would tell on them to the preacher for every little thing they did wrong, and then they would get in trouble with God and their parents. So I told God that I was lonely, and even with having Winn-Dixie. And finally, I prayed for that mouse. Like the preacher suggested, I prayed that he didn't get hurt when he went flying out the door of the Open Arms Baptist Church, Naomi. And I prayed that he landed on a nice, soft patch of grass.